Hi, my name is Michael Grant. I'm an orthopedic surgeon here in Loveland, Colorado, and I've had the opportunity to talk to Bill about some technology in shoulder pad designs for football players. As you can imagine, we see a lot of football players with various injuries to the shoulder, a common injury being that of fractures of the collarbone, and also injuries to the what we call the AC joint, which is where the collarbone meets this segment of the shoulder blade called the acromion. That is called a shoulder separation when that shoulder is dislocated. So if you look at some of the designs of shoulder pads out there, and some of the ones that Bill has shown me, they allow for a lot of play in the outer part of the shoulder, such that when there's a downward force applied to it, it doesn't provide much protection to this part of the joint, or to the collarbone for that matter. The Lok-Cup design, which he also showed me, provides a much greater level of protection for downward force applied to the shoulder. What we see in football players is that a player will be driven into the ground onto his shoulder, and with his own body weight, in addition to the body weight of another player, that forces the pad down enough to cause either a dislocation of this joint or a fracture of the collarbone. Once again, the Lok-Cup design is intended to reduce the force onto this part of the shoulder and protect against those injuries. As I mentioned before, some of the other designs in shoulder pads allow a lot of movement of this segment of the shoulder pad downward. In other words, some of these pads I've seen allow this part of the pad to flex all the way to about 90 degrees. If that's the case, and this is lying over that joint that we talked about before, when the shoulder is driven into the ground, the force is completely absorbed by the end of the shoulder. This design is such that it creates a tension, almost like a strut superiorly, meaning on the upward side, and does not allow this to come down much at all. It allows some play, which is good, because that way it dissipates some of the force, but overall it has very little motion compared to other shoulder pads. Yet at the same time, the player can raise his arms because there's a lot of latitude for what we call abduction, or raising the arm. So the idea is to allow optimal motion for the player, so that players can do what they need to do in the game, and yet at the same time, if the shoulder gets driven into the ground or hit from the front with a helmet or another shoulder, it protects it from that downward force that causes the injuries that we talked about before. I spoke about some of the other shoulder pad designs and how they allow motion at this segment of the shoulder pad. And in fact, if we look at some of the other shoulder pad designs, this portion of the shoulder pad is literally facing downward. What that means is that while it may be covering the shoulder, if the shoulder takes a direct blow from the top, it will allow the shoulder to be forced down and injure those structures that we talked about before. Now this happens for various reasons. Of course, in football players, they are taught to leave their shoulder in order to protect them from neck injuries. So the shoulder may strike another player's thigh, may strike another player's shoulder or helmet, and like I mentioned before, the other mechanism of injury is when a player is driven into the ground onto their shoulder. The difference in the design of the Lok-Cup is that this upper portion acts under tension and acts sort of like a strut to prevent very much downward movement of this section of the shoulder. There is some movement, which is actually good because that will help dissipate some of the force that is applied to the shoulder. But there's not much motion, so it provides much more protection than some of the other designs. At the same time, since the structural strength of this design is up top, it also allows for motion to be retained when the player tries to raise his arm over his head. So positions such as receivers, or even defensemen for that matter, when they need to raise their arms over their head, they still have that motion and yet are protected when force is applied to the shoulder from the top. This type of technology could be applied to a lot of other sports. We see those same type of AC separations in hockey players who are shoved into the wall, lacrosse players who are also driven into the ground, and so there are many other sports in which this type of design may benefit and help minimize the risk of those types of injuries, such as collarbone fractures and AC separations. So in closing, there is no protective device that's going to protect a player 100% against these types of injuries. We do see a lot of these in my practice in terms of both the AC separations that we talked about before and also collarbone fractures. And once again, while this may not prevent all injuries, I do believe that that design, in terms of minimizing the downward force that can be applied to the shoulder and also dissipating that force, I think that this would be extremely helpful in trying to minimize the rate of those injuries that we see.